Good morning, everybody, and thank you for taking time and expressing interest in Mongolia and what we're doing in our region in terms of our diplomatic interaction. And I was just asked to explain why I came late. It's a matter of miscalculation. You always mislead us by saying that Singapore is a small country. As it turns out, it wasn't small. I thought we could reach here much faster, but it turned out to be big. Even your campus, it's unimaginably big. After coming in, we had to circle around, and there had to be a security to guide us. Otherwise, we would get lost here. So, therefore, one thing that I've learned during my visits here, when Singaporeans say that we're a small country, remember, they do not mean it. They're a big economy and very successful economy. And they're really the nation that has shown to the world that you can make it. If Singapore made it within one generation from third world country to move to the first world country, then every one of us can make it. That's one thing, and very positive message. On the other hand, when the UN is talking about Sustainable Development 2030, if all the countries can become Singapore in terms of their development, Sustainability 2030 is an achievable goal. It's just a matter of us believing in ourselves, keeping to consistent policies, respecting each other, celebrating that multiculturalism, and then we can accomplish a lot. So from that perspective, again, Singapore is not a small country. Don't make a mistake about this. Another thing is, you mentioned about Khmer. I do speak Khmer. I studied Cambodian in Moscow. And at that time, as you just rightly mentioned, we have very long-standing diplomatic relationship with Indochina, Southeast Asian countries. And at that time, I was, sent to Moscow in 1988 to study, to do Oriental studies and study Cambodia, because I was trained as a diplomat to export communism to Cambodia. And, somehow world changed. And therefore, I had to change as well. And therefore, besides Cambodian, I had to take up also Thai language in order not to, not to be unemployed, I had to struggle. So that's why I speak Cambodian and I learned Cambodian. Now, coming back to Mongolia, the world is changing, and we all know that. But the world was always changing. But the rate of change these days is much faster and much radical than it used to be before. That is making smaller countries to be more flexible and to adjust to the new realities. But when we're talking about adjusting, it doesn't mean to be only compliant. The world that is being created, it is our world. It's not just big countries' world. So therefore, any form of new architecture of international relations that we're apparently entering into has to be built with our participation. And that is our position. Our voice has to be heard. And even when sometimes we think, well, what difference does it make? Who hears us? We shouldn't be that pessimistic and sitting, behind. Because if we do that, then the world will shape without our participation. But, statistically, numerically, if you take, we have global community of nations. Most of the countries are small countries. And when you take them all, their voice can be heard. We have 50 years of diplomatic relationship with Singapore, and this is the first time, I was myself very surprised, this is the first time our Minister of Foreign Affairs is visiting Singapore with an official visit. And I really, would like to thank Minister Balakrishnan and Dr. Vivian for the invitation. It is setting a new stage of development of relationship between our two countries. But the very reason why we are, before this I was in Czech Republic. Now why we're going around and meeting up with smaller countries is that we have to communicate. We have to be more active in terms of maintaining our dialogue. And then the voice of smaller countries has to be heard. And bigger countries have to hear what smaller countries are saying. The reason for that is this. Because of this reality of being small, very often smaller countries tend to be more balanced. Because this is the mode of surviving. This is the mode when you really measure the power, the fiscal possibilities, the various instruments of influence. And therefore, very often, when bigger countries go into collision course, smaller countries know this little channel through which the conflict can be avoided and we can get out of difficult situations. And the beauty of diplomacy, and Mongolia believes in diplomacy, the beauty of diplomacy is that there is always solution. There is always solution. And especially now, there is always solution because we enjoyed free trade. And free trade was created not only as a mechanism of trading freely, of making businessmen richer. This is also part of the deal. But much bigger cause and intention of this free trade is that when you're in your country, your industries are short of certain resources, you should be able to get it freely on the market. Because if your market is closed and your industry needs it, then we know the bitter history of 2 world wars when if they're not giving, they would just come in and get it. In order to avoid this sort of situation, on the blood we've learned as a humanity this lesson that trade has to be free. The world has to interact with each other. And the beauty of today is that we have abundance of resources, both not only natural, for 7 billion people, this planet can still feed us if we are moderate, if we understand that this generation has more than any generation ever had since the Homo sapiens came into being, evolved into being. We have enough of it. So having enough of it, why are we not satisfied? Because this is our mindset. We have to change our mindset. And this message can come from smaller countries. Now, everywhere when I go and talk, I say one thing. This generation, average person in today's world is living a better in terms of quality and standards life than kings and queens of 100 years back. 100 years back, if a queen or king contracted TB, there was only one outcome. Today, average person won't die of TB. Today, when our kids sit behind this, and communicate with the rest of the world. They play with each other, across the ocean, and they play with each other on the mobile phone. The amount of information 5-year-old kid is getting on that device is something that no king could have dreamt of 100 years back. And this is the world we're living. Why are we quarreling? What is not enough there? At times we have more than enough. There is enough wealth to be shared. And then the problem arises with the fact that we unintentionally, also, the history, every day of history that we're living through, we think we're Homo sapiens, we're so smart, but still we're social animals. We're learning, and it's unstoppable. The world has never been in today of the 21st century. Therefore, we do not know a lot, although we think we know. And therefore, we unintentionally got into the world of division. The split between haves and have-nots has increased unprecedentedly. If you put 1.5% tax on the wealthiest circle in this, and that's minority, on the wealthiest circle in this world, and add their tax by 1.5%, the middle education problem of the whole world can be solved. This is the world in which we're living. This is the world in which we entered unintentionally, because we didn't know that, when 30 years back, Cold War ended, and when we entered into this globalization. Remember, if you read all the articles, we were all optimistic. The bad times were behind. We were beyond historical cycle. It was like reaching, in Buddhist terminology, it would be like reaching the karma, coming out of the cycle of rebirth in history. And we were talking about astronomical figures. WTO is bringing this much money into the economy, trillions and trillions. The figures that economists would not be operating and using in their research a decade ago had become at that time reality of the day. And then in that euphoria, we created false expectations that everybody would become and can become Zuckerbergs. And that is surely not possible. But that expectation was there because if the pie increases, remember the articles of those days, then that increased pie will give benefits to everybody. And then it ended up that few got much more, piece of pie, much bigger piece of pie than the rest of the world. But we should not be blaming someone for that. Simply, we didn't know. And now we can change the world for better. But this can be done without coercion, without pressure, through understanding, through dialogue, through transfer of technologies, through transfer of know-how, through trade, through investment, through educating each other. That is possible because I believe that is possible because in the last 30 years, we did exactly that. And it provided better life for every one of us. So therefore, smaller countries' contribution would be that we actively participate in keeping the world together, in preventing, in changing the rhetoric, in preventing the conflicts and quarrel. And for that, our united voice would be very important. That is one of the reasons why I came over here. Foreign policy objective of Mongolia in today's world is not only the traditional classical one of securing sovereignty and independence of Mongolia, creating a better image of Mongolia, but it also is about responsible citizenship in this world. You know, Mongolia is benefiting out of peace in our region. And that peace is so vital and important for our own economy and for the economy of others that we need to participate in it. Not just have free ride, just saying that, oh, who would listen to us, you know? It's bigger countries' game. Whatever that they come up with, that is what it is. No, that is not what it is. And also bigger countries also have to understand that no big country is too big enough to solve the global problems. And if you look into the history, actually because bigger countries very often overlooked smaller countries, they ended up with bigger problems. Take Roman Empire. They were saying barbarians. And the barbarians ended that Roman Empire. You know, or if you take today, in today's world, you know, when we ended Cold War, we thought, now everybody is on your own, you know, free world, etc. And then the world abandoned Afghanistan. You're on your own. You solve the problem. The problem was already created. And that problem, we needed to help them to solve it. And you know, the interesting thing is that when they blew up the two big Buddhist statues, Mongolia was the country that stood up and said, this is so barbaric and that cannot be tolerated. Not because they touched upon our pride, because simply this was barbaric and it could have further effects. And then they ended up blowing up World Trade Centers. So, and then we thought, this is a small country, how it can hit big country? If we do not solve and leave smaller countries in poverty, in difficulty, they will be no small problem for bigger countries, for the world as a whole. And this is the lesson the world has to learn. Therefore, the interaction with smaller countries, the early signs of problems can be sensed in smaller countries. And therefore, this diplomatic interaction with the smaller countries is for the benefit of the global stability. Now, many people say that, well, Mongolia, when they look at us, they say, you're sandwiched between two big powers. How do you get along? That's a matter of perception. I don't see us sandwiched. I see Mongolia as a country which has the best, strongest, impenetrable two fortresses around us. So security-wise, we're in the best position. We're the jewel that these two big fortresses are protecting. In other words, what I'm really trying to say is that when you are open and when you are genuine in your relationship with your neighbors, we're all human beings. And nation states are also like human beings because it consists of human beings. And when you openly interact and trade and work with your friends, they respond as your friends as well. And for us, now the fact that Russia and China have very good relationship is a new opportunity for us. Because we lived in a world when it was divided and we lived as if we did not have a second neighbor. As if we had only one neighbor. All of our trade was with Comecon countries and we had no trade, no exchange with China. The 4,700 kilometer border was closed, was the most fortified, border. And did we win anything out of that? No. We lost a lot of opportunity there, both Mongolia and Russia. And now that these two countries are getting along and cooperating very actively, we have the opportunity. Now we are the transit country that can provide, transportation services. These two countries are bound to upgrade their trade exchange up to $200 billion by 2020. And the shortest route is through Mongolia. And we already are now talking about economic corridor, and 32 infrastructural projects are being discussed. And these are major investment projects. And countries like Singapore, your investors, which are small, can come and invest in Mongolia, participate in this constructive, projects. Now, besides that, now our trade with China is really going up very fast. Actually, the growth phenomenon of Mongolia, not many people see Mongolia as also economic success story. Because we're a very open, liberal, genuinely democratic society, governments are always criticized. The government bureaucrats are not there to be praised. And probably we also do not deserve being praised. And then in the media, we're always hearing the criticism, how bad the government is, how corrupt it is, how bureaucratic it is, etc. And honestly, all of this is there. It's our social problem that we will have to solve. But if you look into macroeconomic data, also a very different picture will emerge. When we started our transition to market economy in 1990s, after 80 years of communist growth in Mongolia, it changed Mongolia. From the Middle Ages, we moved into the 20th century, but still our GDP was at the level of $2.5 billion after 80 years of communist development. After 30 years of market economic growth, Mongolian GDP today stays at $12 billion. So it's almost, 4 times than that we had in 90s. But more interestingly, from 90s, when we embarked on this transition and change, because of structural reform, our economy collapsed. These were testing times for us. The toughest challenge that Mongolia as a nation faced was within that decade of 90s. The country was impoverished. It was really hard. And only in 2003, we passed the threshold back, the threshold of $1 billion. And in 2011, we were already standing at $11-12 billion economy. So within 8 years, more than tenfold growth. Having GDP grow twofold for some countries is a generational venture. But within 8 years, tenfold. If you look for similar examples, at least in our region, you won't find such an example. In 2011, the GDP growth of Mongolia was at 17.3%. We were the fastest growing economy after Qatar. And I think Azerbaijan at one point reached 25%. So we are, in terms of the performance that we have shown how GDP's economy can grow, we're in the league of top 3. And this is not just figurative growth. The economy indeed grew. And the trade, the immovable properties, the industries also grew. But there is one thing that we've learned, and again, I talked about this global, our success. We are held hostage to our success globally. And interestingly, a mirror reflection of that global phenomenon in Mongolia, we became hostage to our own success as well. Because in the 90s, when it was very difficult, surprising thing, human beings get united in the times of difficulties. And we persevere and recover from any difficulty. But success is much worse test, which we are not equipped to overcome. And therefore, we got back into crisis. And for 4 years, economy, really went down. And now the economy is going up again. In the last 2 years, our economy was pretty stable in its growth. In the first half of this year, we're growing at the rate of 8.5%. Again, we are now the fastest growing economy in Northeast Asia. And Northeast Asia is home to the most dynamic economies: Japan, South Korea, China. And we are, growing very fast. And our trade last year, we had record high trade ever in history of Mongolia. And we had record high exports. And our trade surplus in 2020 was equal almost, 10 with odds % of our GDP. Now, in growing, we want to interact with our friends. And this is part of our foreign policy as well, part of our policy towards Asia. We want to have diversified investment from around the region. We want to have the know-how, the technology, the capital. And the objective of our foreign policy, therefore, is also developmental. Because for us, what we see is that the development of a country is a better weapon for security and independence at times than the weapons themselves, especially for smaller countries. And also for smaller countries in today's world, visibility is a better instrument of security. Therefore, we should be supporting each other in making ourselves visible so that 7 billion people know about us. And if we are jeopardized, we want bigger portion of 7 billion people saying that they do not deserve this difficulty. We want to help. And exactly in order to create this, we are also participating in peacekeeping operations. Yes, we are contributing our peacekeepers to a variety of projects. Why? First, as I said, we want to be responsible citizen, global citizen as a nation. We want to help those who are in the need of the basic thing. Peace is the basic thing. It absolutely must be there. And in some countries, it is in such deficit. And people are fighting for their lives on everyday basis. And we do not see it good enough. And we want to participate in changing such a situation. We want to come and help the most in need, to help them so that they get security at least. Because when people live in security, they can improve their lives themselves. That basic condition has to be created. That is the objective of the United Nations. That is the objective of our foreign policy as well. And through that responsible participation, we also want to gain more friends, increase the number of our friends in the global world. So this is the approach of ours when it comes to peace and security. Also, when we're talking about peacekeeping, We remember what our ancestors did before, and we're learning from our mistakes, and therefore we become now peacekeepers, not the conquerors. So, therefore, we really take peace seriously, and especially now. Especially now. We all take peace for granted. We always think, who would go to war, you know? Because if you go to war, everybody dies, so nobody will go to war. It's not like that. Human beings at times can be very irrational. In philosophy, we have a whole, school of thought, irrationalism. Why do we have that? Because people can be irrational. Because in our history, there were cases when, when one person is irrational, you can, it's just him. But there were cases when whole nations were irrational. The whole world was irrational. And we did not become better. We're still the same human beings. Therefore, irrationalism is there. Therefore, peace should not be taken for granted. It can be breached. Therefore, Mongolia, for example, in Northeast Asian region, when we are interacting with North Korea, that's what we're pursuing. This total, irreversible, verifiable denuclearization is about our security, security of our people, and it's about the security of our friends in the region, of our neighbors. Therefore, we also do not want to sit silent, have this free ride, but we want to be part of bringing peace to the global community. So, in short, probably I'm running out of time, right? So, in short, what I'm really trying to say is that Mongolia is trying to be active. Mongolia is trying to be helpful. Mongolia wants to be prosperous. And all of this is reflected and part and parcel of our foreign policy objectives. And that's what we're pursuing. And even today when I visit this country, these are the ideas that we bear in our mind. Thank you.